Thank you very much for joining us today. It's Friday, November 12th, and today for the Higher Education Learning Community Seminar Series, we have Professor Whitworth from Agnes Scott College. First, I just wanted to introduce you to the Higher Education Learning Community. We're a action group within the Greater Atlanta RCE, and this is one of the activities that we plan each year, a monthly seminar series on research. We do our best to diversify the groups of people that we interact with across all of the Greater Atlanta RCE universities. And we're very happy to have Professor Whitworth here with us today. She's an interdisciplinary scholar who combines her training in women's, gender, and sexuality studies with her extensive background in art history and film and media studies. Her research interests include feminist and queer theory, sexuality studies, film and visual culture, and specifically LGBTQ+ media studies and eco-criticism. Her current book project, Environmental Eros, Picturing Feminist, Queer, and Trans Ecologies, brings together gender and sexuality studies, film studies, and environmental studies. The book focuses on the environmental ethics and activism of the 1970s ecological feminists, the radical fairy movement, and several contemporary environmental groups, including Ecosexuality Movement and the Queer Eco-Justice Project. Whitworth conducts close readings of understudied literature, drawings, and films produced by figures associated with these Back to the Land movements. She's also at work on two additional projects, one examining representations of rural LGBTQ+ life in narrative film, and the other exploring the role of film and media in the history of HIV/AIDS activism. In 2018, Professor Whitworth received the Karen Green Human Relations Award from the Gay Johnson McDougall Center for Global Diversity and Inclusion and the Coalition of the Student Multicultural Organizations. You can tell I'm a biologist. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Lauran. Thank you very much for coming.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much, Michael, for that introduction and for inviting me to speak today. It's a treat to get to talk about my research. And I'm delighted to learn more about RCE for ESD, particularly this higher learning community. And if long acronyms are any indication of the brain power of this group, you all are off the charts. I've also recently, you've reminded me I need to update my bio, but I've become co-director of the ESS minor at Agnes Scott. So it's really nice to be finding myself in more ESS related circles of late. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and pull up my presentation. Can everyone see the screen okay? Great. So we're going to back up just a second. All right. So I figured that we were going to be coming from an array of disciplines, and I decided to build into the beginning of my talk just some general commentary on gender, sexuality, and climate justice, and some sort of contemporary stats to kind of be a framing, and then also a brief introduction to the field of queer ecology, where my research sits. So here's my game plan for the talk. I'll start with some contemporary relevance of gender and sexuality to ESS and climate justice, and then give you a brief introduction to the academic subfield of queer ecology. And then we'll look at some LGBTQ environmental groups that I've been studying for several years now, their writings, illustrations, and photographs from the 1970s to today. And then we'll have some time for Q&A and discussions. But I'll stop periodically. You can check in to see if anyone has a burning question. So what do gender and sexuality have to do with climate injustice, climate justice? So we know that that women's domestic responsibilities, such as gathering water and growing food, render them most impacted by climate disasters and climate change. And yet there are few opportunities for them to be part of environmental decision-making. We also know that because of climate migration and displacement, that women and girls comprise 80% of climate refugees who are displaced by climate change. We also know that women who are climate migrants are at increased risk of experiencing sexual violence. And we know that LGBTQ people who cross national borders, sometimes spurred by climate disasters or climate change, are often more rigorously interrogated by border security and denied entry. Also, gender segregation in border facilities puts trans and gender nonconforming and gender non-binary folks in a precarious position. We know that climate disaster research by the UN has shown that natural disasters kill women at 14 times the rate of men, and poor women's lower socioeconomic status puts them at even greater risk. Following natural disasters, LGBTQ+ folks may be excluded from relief efforts, emergency shelters, and even official death records. LGBTQ youth comprise 40% of houseless youth, so they're very overrepresented in that data. And we know that displaced people face higher risks during extreme weather events. As far as gender-based violence is concerned, research shows that sex trafficking, sexual violence, and gender-based violence against women and people of marginalized genders, especially trans women, increase during and after extreme weather events. We even see gender-based violence used as a tool of intimidation against environmental activists. And then lastly, and one that maybe isn't as obvious to folks, are the connections between reproductive justice and climate justice. So natural disasters increase the risk of pregnancy complications and miscarriages, and Black, Latinx, and disabled women already face higher risks of complications during pregnancy and are thus most susceptible to rising temperatures and other environmental impacts. So it just gives you some just like little educational information for folks who may be less familiar. And at the end, I cite these reports so you can check some of them out. So now I just want to give a brief overview of queer ecology. So a number of monographs and anthologies published in the first 2 decades of the 21st century attest to growing scholarly interest in bringing together sexuality and environmental studies. While gender is increasingly used as an analytic frame in discussions of climate change, sexuality has less often been addressed in environmental and sustainability studies. Additionally, histories of American environmentalism rarely mention lesbian or gay environmentalism, in spite of the simultaneous emergence of the environmental movement and the gay rights movement in the 1960s and 70s. Some have attributed this dearth in LGBTQ environmental history and scholarship to denaturalizing tendencies in queer theory, a field steeped in anti-foundationalism and wary of biological determinism, or the belief that human behavior is innate and rooted in biology. Early scholarship specifically attuned to queerness and nature focused on how rhetoric of the natural has been used against marginalized groups, including Indigenous peoples, women, people of color, and also queer folks. For example, in Toward a Queer Ecofeminism from 1997, Greta Gard examines the social construction of the natural in Christianity and colonialist rhetoric. Deploying a queer ecofeminist lens, she elucidates the ways queer people are, quote, feminized, animalized, eroticized, and naturalized in a culture that devalues women, animals, nature, and sexuality. Gard's observations have served as a touchstone for more recent intersectional queer environmental studies. Just as feminist theory has experienced renewed interest in the natural sciences, especially pertaining to climate change and the Anthropocene, queer studies has increasingly turned its attention to the ecological as well. I'm having to move my window so you can read. Here's a very lengthy quote, so apologies for the size, by environmental studies scholar Catriona Sandilands, who co-edited the anthology Queer Ecologies that was pictured on the previous slide. She explains the term queer ecology refers to a loose, interdisciplinary constellation of practices that aim in different ways to disrupt prevailing heterosexist, discursive, and institutional articulations of sexuality and nature, and also to reimagine evolutionary processes, ecological interactions, and environmental politics in light of queer theory. Drawing from traditions as diverse as evolutionary biology, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, transsexual, intersex, queer, questioning, two-spirited, and allies movements, and queer geography and history, feminist science studies, ecofeminism, and environmental justice, queer ecology currently highlights the complexity of contemporary biopolitics, draws important connections between the material and cultural dimensions of environmental issues, and insists on an articulatory practice in which sex and nature are understood in light of multiple trajectories of power and matter, end quote. So beyond discursive analyses of the natural, interdisciplinary scholarship in queer environmental studies has explored topics ranging from queer animals to eco-normativity found in many conventional environmental campaigns. So here I just sort of outlined, pulling from the introduction of the Queer Ecologies anthology, just several trends that you see in this scholarship. So sexual politics and the politics of the natural have also informed one another when it comes to the regulation of natural spaces. So for example, in the United States, male homosexuality became associated with urban degeneracy and was one of several factors spurring the national parks movement, which aimed to reignite masculine vigor and restore national character while also justifying the relocation of Indigenous people. At the same time, urban green spaces, such as city parks, became well-known and heavily policed sites for gay cruising. Although LGBTQ communities are often associated with metropolitan areas, contemporary ethnographies of rural LGBTQ life demonstrate that bars, community centers, and communes have also been sites of queer resistance. And my own research has focused on both historical and fictional connections between LGBTQ life and the environment. So number 4 on this list. And then I'm going to give you a snippet of that research via the environmental ethics and aesthetics of a few of these historical and contemporary groups. But here, just to underscore some of these different threads, as like my kind of little mini lit review showed, generally queer ecological scholarship has focused on scientific study of queer critters or critters who have what's perceived as queer practices, medical, legal, religious discourse. So who and what is natural, if you think of anti-sodomy laws. Then biopolitics with regards to the regulation of nature spaces, sort of who is the imagined sort of inhabitant and user, and who has been removed or is sort of out of place there. And then the last one, sites of queer resistance. And I'm going to focus on 4A for this talk, which is looking at some actual rural queer communities and some of the writings that they produced there. And then the gay pastoral, I mean, think like Brokeback Mountain and like the poetry of Walt Whitman. That term was came about in the 1980s out of literary studies. So the symbolism of the rhizome, or horizontal plant stem that grows underground and from which new plants and roots can emerge, was popularized in academic circles by French philosopher Gilles Deleuze and psychoanalyst Félix Guattari in the introduction to their 1987 text, 1,000 Plateaus. Deleuze and Guattari expand the term to include animals like ants and rats, and ultimately use rhizomes to describe a multiplicity of non-hierarchical forms of thought and communication. The concept has been applied to network theory and to media studies. Feminist theorists like Elizabeth Graz have also been drawn to the symbol, which she describes as, quote, an underground but perfectly manifest network of multiple branching roots and shoots with no central axis, no unified point of origin, and no given direction of growth. A proliferating, somewhat chaotic, and diversified system. The rhizome has also been adopted in social justice circles as a symbol of resilience and interdependence. And here is our illustrations by Vicki Reynolds, who has written about rhizomes and social justice. She writes, quote, growing horizontally underground, rhizomes are able to survive extreme weather. The rhizome has been picked up in activist culture for its usefulness in dismantling hierarchy and power structures while inviting a form that is more organic, responsive, co-creative, and alive. The rhizome is a fitting metaphor for my talk today as I discuss environmental ethics and aesthetics in LGBTQ print materials in the contemporary US. Many which include nature-inspired iconography, not unlike the illustrations that you see on the screen now. In this talk, I will highlight a number of periodicals and zines from the 1970s to today, paying particular attention to the feminist and queer environmental ethics espoused in these materials, and the eco-aesthetics used to help express these ideas. Not only does this content, the content of these materials contain images of tubers, trees, and other flora in illustrations, poetry, and prose, but these periodicals also functioned and continue to function rhizomatically as a mode of communication. They facilitate what zine scholar Alison Pipemeyer calls embodied community, as zines reconnect us to our bodies and to other human beings, and as I'll demonstrate, connect us to non-human nature as well. As one might expect, nature imagery is a prevalent trope in American feminist cultural production of the 1970s, where metaphors of human growth as trees, drawings of shells and roots, and female-centric myths rife with nature symbolism and homeopathic tutelage abound. Much of this alignment of female-bodied beings with the natural environment has been dismissed as spurring gender essentialism and positing an eternal and ever-nurturing femininity more attuned to and thus best equipped to protect Mother Earth. However, in a chapter of my current book project, I argue that these critiques have too quickly renounced ecofeminism and thus neglected its impact on current trends in feminist and queer environmentalism. As is evident in 1970s print culture, film, and photography, the land was integral to many feminists' self and communal identity and their efforts to achieve cultural visibility. Whether women were literally returning to the land by establishing collectives and communes, such as those still in existence today in Southern Oregon, or whether their returns were more figurative, much feminist art and literature of the 1970s was environmentally themed and served as a vehicle for feminist politics, sexuality, and spirituality. While this feminist iconography contains depictions of nature as an ideal setting for the establishment of individual and communal identity, thus infusing these materials with an oft criticized escapist air, these illustrations of writings demonstrate that the natural environment was not a utopic elsewhere, but an essential actor in transformative reimaginings of subjecthood and relationality. And you find reading these materials that while many people may have gone to these communes with idealistic thoughts about how living off the land was going to play out, they very quickly found that it was difficult work. Writing on the naming patterns in titles of lesbian and gay periodicals, Robert Reidinger observes, the ideas of oneness with the plant and the desirability of creating or renewing one's ties to it via ceremonies of various kinds achieved a rebirth in the 1960s and 70s, assisted in no small part by the rise of an active environmental movement, as well as the popularization of Eastern philosophies, stressing the interconnection of all life. Reidinger's survey of lesbian feminist and lesbian feminist titles confirms the pervasiveness of nature imagery in art and literature of this period. Titles like maize, calyx, grapevine, amaranth, and grassroots emphasize growth and sustenance. Insect imagery in titles such as chrysalis connote transformation and unfurling, even coming out. And political and oceanic imagery converge in lesbian tide, gay tide, and making waves, all of which convey a sense of restless energy and unceasing activity. Reidinger illuminates the prevalence of this turn to nature in lesbian and gay artistic, literary, and political publications, but he falls short of exploring the philosophical underpinnings and ethical implications of this imagery. So relatively little has been written on lesbian feminist aesthetics. In one of the few journal articles devoted to the topic, Margot Hobbs Thompson investigates the various styles and subject matter of this 1970s lesbian sensibility. While Thompson acknowledges the role of nature imagery in lesbian feminist art and writing, she ultimately oversimplifies this woman-nature association as an alignment that merely, quotes, recast as positive many of the negative stereotypes associated with women in patriarchal society. In what follows, I examined several LGBTQ periodicals, illuminating a number of aesthetic trends and their philosophical underpinnings, such as the use of nature as a model for self and societal transformation, and a melding, not just an alignment, but really a transfiguration of human subjects and non-human nature. Many women's land communes in the United States were founded in the 1970s as part of a burgeoning lesbian separatist movement that coincided with growing environmental activism. Lesbian Nation was one of numerous ideologies circulating at this time, and it entailed women establishing their own non-patriarchal culture, which included alternative economies such as barter systems and skill sharing, cooperative childcare initiatives, and communes. Ethnographic studies of these groups have centered on Southern Oregon, and the images here are from that area. However, primary materials collected in the 1985 anthology Lesbian Land confirm that these back to land communities existed throughout the United States, including in the southern US. So there was Pagoda in Florida, and there were other communes in Alabama and Mississippi as well. Much of what is known about this period in lesbian history comes from reader-written periodicals, which circulated between and beyond these rural communities. These archival materials also shed light on the environmental positions held by many of these groups. And so here you have a page from the publication or journal, So's Your Old Lady. And this is a country lesbian manifesto. And so I'm just going to share just a little bit from it. So the authors write, quote, "A lifestyle in which you must keep yourself warm, fed, and clean without central heating, plumbing, or plentiful jobs becomes a gratifying reinforcement of self-respect and strength, which is for us a step in learning to live as a positive contributor to the environment around us." The yoking of environmental stewardship with self-sufficiency, evident here, recurs throughout this branch of 1970s and 80s lesbian feminist thought. One of the more well-known communities, Owl Farm, those images on the previous slide are from that commune, which later became the Oregon Women's Land Trust, explicitly outlined its desire to be an ecologically sound land-based community in its charter, which documented its commitment, quote, "to preserve land and protect it from speculation and overdevelopment, and to foster the recognition of land as a sacred heritage and resource belonging to all." Most of these back to land initiatives were short-lived because of financial constraints and the challenges of shared governance. However, the development of Lesbian Natural Resources, a nonprofit established in 1991 to support lesbian land projects, as well as the persistence of several of these communities today, attest to the ongoing legacy of this subculture. Janet Grant's logo for A Woman's Place, which is on your screen now, is from a women's land community in rural New York. It shows two hands emerging from a tree. From one hand, a white bird, perhaps a dove and a symbol for peace, takes flight, while the other hand grips a hammer. And the implication is that these women are extensions of nature, communing with her and building with what she provides. The commune's name appears to grow out of the tree roots, and that name also becomes the foundation upon which the tree rests. The implications of a symbiotic relationship are clear. Just as the tree provides for its inhabitants, so too these inhabitants will support the tree. These self-identified land dykes were building literal structures while also building community and consciously constructing lesbian culture. This is clear in the frontispiece of Woman's Spirit, the first issue, which was a quarterly periodical published from 1974 and 1984 by women's land pioneers and longtime partners Ruth and Jean Mountain Grove. In the inaugural 1974 issue, the editors wrote an expository piece entitled "Why Woman's Spirit?" on a page underscored by a lifelike drawing of a sinewy rhizome. They inscribed, quote, "We are feeling stirrings inside us that tell us that what we are making is nothing less than a new culture. What women are doing by exploring the spiritual sides of their lives is essential for the building of a new women's culture. We must decide what we will take with us on this creative journey, what parts of our experiences are valuable and needed for our continued struggle? What behavior, thought patterns, values, images, illusions, and artifacts of non-feminist culture will we choose to leave behind? As we continue to tear down the institutions and relationships that oppress us, we are also building, making, and creating. And this root imagery is especially fitting for the founding statement of Women's Spirit, one of the first of an array of periodicals crucial in establishing and maintaining lesbian feminist community at this time. The advent of Women's Spirit coincided with the rise of the alternative feminist press network that flourished in the 1970s and 80s in the United States. So I'm thinking about Audre Lorde and others' creation of like Kitchen Table Press. Like other 1970s feminist print ephemera, such as the Los Angeles-based Lesbian Tide, which was the first national lesbian newspaper, Women's Spirit began as a reader-written quarterly with a regional audience. However, over time, it achieved national distribution through sales in feminist bookstores, music stores, and also through exchanges with other feminist presses. Unlike many of these publications, which were produced in city centers, Women's Spirit was created at Rootworks, part of the Oregon Women's Land Trust. Like its gay male counterpart, which I'll talk about shortly, RFD, or Radical Fairy Digest, Women's Spirit focused on the lives of rural women and lesbians with hopes of building community beyond the urban centers most often associated with lesbian and gay life. Just as roots ground a plant to return to why Women's Spirit, so too print materials such as these were foundational for this emergent facet of lesbian culture and lesbian feminist identity, an identity bolstered by a relationship with the environment. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of human, non-human hybridity that is a common trope in these materials. And I won't go into a ton of detail about them, but we can talk more about them in the Q&A if that would be helpful. So these are both illustrations from Women's Spirit. The one on the right from spring 1976, and the one on the left from summer 1975. And I see these human tree hybrids as these kind of like monstrous incarnations of unsettling yet welcomed upheavals of the autonomous human subject. They also challenge the kind of disconnect between human and that kind of human nature divide. And then on the next slide is a poem that's characteristic of writings from this period. It comes from Dreaming, an Almanac of Lesbian Lore and Vision. And the poem reads, "I am the green child, I am the child of rain. Green leaves curl and speak from my tongue. White flowers open. White flowers are my eyes. My green arms spill out the rushing rivers. My fingers are green with the water's sounds. Birds sing in my mouth ancient songs." So you see this hybridity in the verses of poetry as well. Let me just stop there for a minute before I move into the next section and just see if anybody has any questions. If not, we can keep trucking. All right, well, I'll continue. We find very similar imagery in RFD, a country journal for gay men everywhere. RFD bills itself as the oldest reader-written gay quarterly around. The journal began in a farmhouse in Grinnell, Iowa. It was founded by working class gay men who were inspired by the rural lesbian separatist periodical Country Women. The first issue of RFD was released during the autumn equinox of 1974, several years ahead of the first Radical Fairy gatherings, which were held in Arizona in 1979 and in Colorado in 1980. And on the left of your screen is a flyer for the first inaugural gathering. For folks who For folks who aren't familiar with them, the Radical Fairies are an international network of gay and queer identified beings, chiefly male-bodied, for whom nature worship and nature-based ritual are a central part of their amorphous spiritual practice. On Labor Day weekend in 1979, gay activist Harry Hay, Don Kilhefner, and Mitch Walker hosted a spiritual conference for Radical Fairies at a desert sanctuary near Tucson, Arizona. And on the right, you'll see a photograph from a march, and the figure on the right with the black cap is Harry Hay, who's probably the most famous veteran gay rights advocate in this group. Hay is also credited with coming up with the name, coupling radical, meaning root, essence, or politically extreme, with fairy, which you'll see spelled a number of different ways in these writings, an insulting epithet hurled at gay men, but also a synonym for nature spirits. In the face of internalized homophobia and the devastating effects of the AIDS epidemic, fairies and their allies sought solace in the secluded enclaves of Wolf Creek, Oregon, and Short Mountain, Tennessee. A number of these communes are still active today, and you'll find them all over the world in Canada, Great Britain, France, and Australia. And here, these are two pictures from Mandala in Australia, which was founded in 1973 and was the country's first fairy commune. On the title page of the inaugural issue of RFD, the editorial team states the journal's goals, quote, to break down the feeling of isolation that many experience in rural settings, to build some sense of community among rural gay people, and to provide the means of sharing with each other our thoughts, feelings, and ideas about our unique experience as gay country people. Early issues of RFD were printed by the lesbian-run Iowa City Press. And as scholar of queer rural studies, Scott Herring has noted the influence of lesbian print culture extends beyond the publication process. Herring devotes a chapter of his book, Another Country, Queer Anti-Urbanism, to the stylistics of country women and RFD. And there are covers of the journals on your screen now. He delineates a distinct anti-urbanism, what he calls a critical rusticity, in both periodicals. Explaining country women's impact on RFD, he mentions, quote, what this rural lesbian separatist collective unleashed against the advocates' male nudist colonies was a stylistic anarchy opposite the graphic idealizations of gay male cosmo-urbanism. Country Women offered readers a critical rusticity that encouraged a lack of cultural sophistication and a preference for practical know-how. So throughout all of these publications, you see everything from like recipes and cures for the common like homeopathic cures for colds, etc., to like building advice and diagrams, photographs of sustainable practices and techniques that were being used on many of these communes. Like the lesbian feminist periodicals discussed previously, RFD also contains rhizomatic and stolonic imagery and cover art illustrations and photographs. So I'll just show you a few of those. These are some covers of RFD, which actually still comes out today. And if you search them, they have digitized many of their issues. And then here are some photographs by Leo Serpent, where you have a human figure sort of spread horizontally between trees and foliage. And this imagery serves as a metaphor for rebirth and also as a symbol of the radical fairies' communitarian response ethics, which are deeply rooted in their veneration for the natural world and also for one another. Any questions before I move into the final example that I'm going to share with you all? Okay. So my last case study is the zine Queer Ancestral Futures, which was created in 2019 by members of the Queer Eco-Justice Project, an Oakland-based grassroots environmental activist group that organizes at the intersection of ecological justice and queer liberation. They explain their work as, quote, an intersectional movement platform to catalyze culture, consciousness, and community around our collective concerns and building coalition across difference. Through study groups, interactive workshops, events, and cultural productions, we cultivate and support projects that strive to improve the ecological and social well-being of LGBT communities, end quote. The zine's authors are Desiree Fontenot, a Black queer scholar, activist, and farmer who's based in Oakland, California, and Vanessa Raditz, a genderqueer farmer, researcher, educator who is currently living in Athens, Georgia, while pursuing their PhD in geography. Vanessa is also in the process of completing a film entitled Fire and Flood about queer, trans, and Indigenous environmental activists and their responses to the October 2017 Tubbs fire in Sonoma County, California, which occurred almost simultaneously, just a few weeks apart from Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico in September of that same year. Proceeds from the zine sales benefit the film project, and the zine pays homage to its rural queer foreparents, such as the Radical Fairies. And it also gives an overview of the academic subfield of queer ecology, which I mentioned previously. QEP critiques queer ecology for, quote, its propagation of Eurocentric knowledge production. And I'm going to move to the next slide, but I did just want to point out QEP's logo. So they have the pink triangle, which has roots to the Holocaust and was put on queer prisoners. And then it was reclaimed by ACT UP, the AIDS activist group in the 1980s. And here they've used the pink triangle with the acronym for Queer Eco-Justice Project. And then you have these sinewy roots that and tendrils that are rather rhizomatic and extend out from the logo. As a corrective, the zine centers LGBTQ voices of color and Indigenous history, stressing that queer and trans folks of color are on the front lines of climate crises, and they're also leaders unsung leaders in the eco-justice movement. In a note to the reader, Desi and Vanessa write, quote, we encourage you to reach out your tendrils into this mycelial network that is growing in breadth and depth, sharing knowledge and resources for our collective survival and liberation. And mycelium, for folks who don't know, is the vegetative part of a fungus colony that consists, like rhizomes, of a mass of branching thread-like tendrils that connect different plants and trees. And recent scientific study by forest ecologists like Suzanne Simard, who actually has a TED Talk on this if you're interested, has revealed that trees use these underground networks to communicate and share resources with one another. So if a tree is higher and has access to more light, it will share the sugars it produces from photosynthesis with a surrounding tree that maybe not getting as much light. And this sharing of information and resources reminds me of mutual aid networks, which have long been created and championed by queer, trans, and disabled activists. And it's also they're being written about a lot in the context of COVID-19 and also environmental issues like the forest fires in California that this summer that pose particular risks to folks with respiratory issues and people with mobility issues, et cetera. Borrowing from Movement Generation's Just Transition diagram, which has also been distributed as a zine in its own right, QEP explains the need to transition from an extractive economy to a living, regenerative economy, which they describe as, quote, an economy based on reflective, responsive, reciprocal relationships of interdependence between human communities and the living world upon which we depend. And you can see on the right side, they contrast features of a living economy, which contain graphics of networked and interdependent beings contributing to one another's mutual flourishing. So ecological and social well-being, resource regeneration, deep democracy, et cetera. And that's contrasted with an extractive economy that is focused on extraction, exploitation, militarism, and amassing and consolidation of wealth and power and consumerism. QEP closes their zine with a queer magic manifesto flanked by intertwined flowers and vine graphics, not unlike the earlier periodicals and illustrations we were looking at. They write, our queer magic is our resilience and resistance and strategies for collective survival. Our queer magic is our power to transform, to change, to transition. Our queer magic is our culture of care, the way we build and nurture queer families and kinship. Like Woman Spirit and RFD, QEP zine underscores communion with more than human nature and with one another. Fittingly, they feature other queer and trans groups who are doing eco-justice work, including Queer Magic for the Resistance, a grassroots queer collective that trains and mobilizes street medics, healers, and artists who support environmental activists and who activate during natural disasters. So, for example, following the fires in Sonoma County. This group their first zine was Perfect Flowers and was entitled Perfect Flowers. The group is called Interlocking Roots, and they're a network of queer, trans, Black, Indigenous people of color who are farmers and earth stewards. And this first zine of theirs, called Perfect Flowers, is a queer botany zine that was created in 2017. As Pipemeyer maintains, zines make visible the desire for community and connection. They also literally bring people together in the form of zine release parties, musical performances, film screenings, and other communal events where they're distributed from person to person. They connect people virtually when they're distributed via mail or online. And these print materials not only highlight and help sustain communities of care, they're also the result of great care, as their creation requires sustained time and attention, which are increasingly rare in our current stage of late capitalism. Pipemeyer sees zines operating within what she calls a pedagogy of hope, as they show readers ways to resist the culture of domination. And the materials I discussed today, they highlight the resilience of feminist and queer communities, proving that in the face of governmental inaction and corporate negligence, grassroots community-based interventions are our best strategies for fostering human and non-human flourishing. As climate crises become more urgent, these examples of interdependence and human, non-human kinship offer us models for radical change and for lasting transformation. that concludes my talk. But I'm happy to pull things back up for us to take a look at in more detail.
Thank you, Lauran.
Sure. Any questions, comments, connections? Yeah, Bruce.
Thank you, Lauran. Really interesting set of experiences that I'm glad to have learned about. I'm hoping you could comment on the political position of the queer ecology movement. And I have in mind a couple of things, but you might take us in a different direction. I'm thinking that the environmental movement has had kind of different facets to it. There's been the mainstream environmental movement, which in the US might be characterized by the Sierra Club, but then there's the deep ecology movement and the groups like Greenpeace that sort of move out to the edges and don't engage as much with the political authorities, but create a pressure that maybe backstops and supports those who are engaging with the political authorities. That dichotomy, but then the other one I have in mind is between what are sometimes called the conservationists and the preservationists, those who see the environment through anthropocentric lenses, who want the natural world to support human society in a sustainable way, versus those who see the natural system as having its own right, its own ethos, and our species as being no more important than any other species. Can you give us a sense of how the queer ecologists have fit into this political landscape?
Yeah, for sure. Those are great questions. So yeah, I would say they definitely follow kind of the model of more kind of outside of what Joni Seeger calls the eco-establishment. So they are outside of, like, you gave a good example of like the Sierra Club. They're kind of outside of those more much larger national groups, but certainly interface with those groups at times when they find themselves, where you might have a local chapter of the Sierra Club that is getting involved in a particularly like a local issue, and they find themselves then overlapping in that way. Interestingly, eco-feminists have been very critical of like the deep ecology movement for its lack of gender-based analysis. And eco-feminists have rightly been critiqued by folks in the environmental justice movement for its failure to acknowledge race. And so interestingly, you see some of these different groups critiquing one another. And then I would say is the conservationists versus preservationists. These groups definitely embody what you described, the latter of what you described, which is you can even see this in illustrations that they have. So instead of the typical sort of great chain of being-esque model where you have human at the top of the pinnacle of species, and then below you have other creatures kind of hierarchized as well. You see they will have a field in that, instead of a square, it'll be a circle, and it's like everything is on the same plane. So they I mean, we struggle, and my students often pick this up. I'm teaching an ecological feminisms class right now. That's actually, it's one of my favorite classes I think I've taught, probably because it does give me the chance to think about my research, which we don't always get to do in our many meetings and other duties. But you see an effort for feminist and queer ecological activists and thinkers to try to get away from anthropocentrism and try to think beyond themselves. Like Donna Haraway is a good example of this. She's kind of like probably the most famous feminist science philosophers. She has her PhD is from history of consciousness. in UC, is it Santa Cruz, I think, or San Diego. And she is trained as a zoologist, but also has a background in philosophy. And so you see this in her writing. I'm thinking of When Species Meet, for example, her 2008 book, where she is trying to think about like how we can sort of like get outside of ourselves and human perception of nature, and we don't fall into the trap of like valuing animals, some animals who are more human-like than others. And so like, how do we kind of get outside ourselves to say that these things have, these elements of kind of more than human nature have like agency and, power outside of their relationship to us, et cetera. So she has like a chapter on like the ethics of lab animals. And she gives examples of, what it could look like. And one scientist, I can't remember the person's name, but the person studies some kind of like, microscopic organism that responds to light. And so that scientist has like figured out how the organisms respond to light and tries to like have that ideal light setting set for whatever it is that she's working with. So I'm trying to think of, another, she looks at like primatologists who have, instead of doing the kind of traditional like observational techniques, have like taken on some characteristics of the animals that they study and tried to like learn how it is that they move in space and communicate, et cetera, and to emulate that instead of coming from a human perspective. But yeah, I would definitely say these groups are of the, nature like would go on without us, and we are the causing harm, and it is incumbent upon us to fit ourselves into the sort of natural order of things. Hence, you had these communes where they, really lived completely sort of reliant on the land. That's why many of them didn't last very long without running water and some form of energy, et cetera.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, Kate, I think I saw you had a question.
Thank you. And thank you so much for your presentation and sharing your research. Perhaps this is less of a question and more of a comment because I think you answered it at the end, but I was really interested to kind of hear more about how the intersection of race with these different identities may inform queer ecology and eco-justice and how it manifests in art. And I know you addressed that with the interlocking roots, the perfect flowers as an example, and there was one other as well, and maybe it's just more of a comment and question of whether or not you might be willing to share your slides following your presentation, and if you have any other leads for us who might be interested in learning more about that intersection.
For sure. Yeah, I'll share my slides. I'm happy to share slides with you all. I can send them to Michael to share with the folks who were here. And I point to a number of different sources. I think the issue of, I think both many of these groups that I'm talking about have been criticized for their lack of racial diversity. And then you also have like the mainstream environmental movement, which has been pretty pathetic at acknowledging like equity issues. And then you have queer theory, which is overwhelmingly white as well. So there is, though, there's a queer of color critique and that emerged in response and has challenged queer theory to be more, both be more like connected to material reality instead of just philosophizing about gender and sexuality all the time, and then also to take into account things like race. There were some person of color separatist communes. So one example is called La Luz, and it was in California, and off of I-5, and I think it emerged in 1977 or 78. And there are like these horrible stories of like a couple of white lesbian land groups from like neighboring areas, like protesting the creation of this person of color commune, women of color commune. So you definitely basically saying like, why would you need to start a new commune when you can join ours, even though many of these groups were being critiqued for being hostile to women of color. Radical fairies, interestingly, they get critiqued for, and all of these groups really have ecofeminists as well, for cultural appropriation and kind of orientalizing indigenous culture, but being like completely disconnected from what's actually happening to indigenous peoples. And I actually saw, probably because they're more recent than some of the lesbian feminist periodicals, some of the radical fairy periodicals in the 90s, for example, they acknowledge this and grapple with it. And you also had the emergence of groups like one based in Atlanta in the 80s called Black and White Men Together. And so you see some shift in like the 90s, I would say, with increasing attention to race. And I think where we are like today with Queer Eco Justice Project, it benefits from like having intersectionality as an analytical lens that we got out, from Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 80s. And it sees itself much more grounded in environmental justice, and just has much more nuanced understandings of how these different issues fit together in a way that I think some of these earlier groups were trying to figure out. They were active critiques, as you would expect, from the 1960s of militarism. And many of these folks were also involved in the anti-war movement. Groups had like pen pals with incarcerated folks. We're certainly, class was a major issue on these communes, because often the lands were purchased by wealthier members of the groups. And then there was tension with other groups over like funding, et cetera. But yeah, race has really been, was really not, central to many of these groups. And I think we see contemporary groups like the Queer Eco Justice Project aware of that history.
Great, thank you so much for the additional information.
Sure.
I wondered if you knew how much some of these more established and groups with long history within queer eco movement have interfaced, or that more popular sort of queer activists like Jamie Margolin of 0 Hour. Has there been much interface between the two, or are they mostly separated out?
Yeah, I think there definitely is overlap for sure. So I included on my slide, you'll see some like names of folks who, like Anthony Torres and others, who are in a number of different groups. So I think you definitely see overlap with some of these thinkers who belong to like a multitude of grassroots groups, et cetera. And really, I mean, there's one major difference, I think, especially for the early lesbian separatist groups, is that they were really trying to separate themselves, and, as a sort of rejection of mainstream society. And so they were by nature like very insular and like literally separate. And I think in contemporary environmental activism, most people don't have that ability. We are kind of in the throes and in the mix of, we can't separate ourselves from society. And so I think what you see in contemporary models is much more focused on coalition building, and having multiple, not only people working within multiple groups, but having also multiple groups who are focused on a common issue, whether it's environmental racism, toxic cleanup of a Superfund site, opposing, clear cutting and development, et cetera. So you see a lot of coalition building around a particular interest that will pique the interest of groups who do have these pretty intersectional and expansive understandings of like what constitutes the environment and environmental.
Any other questions for Lauran? Well, thank you very much, Lauran. This was great. I learned a lot.
Great. Thanks so much for having me. This was a treat. Thanks for spending some of your Friday lunch hour with me.